Hello and welcome to today's lesson on opposition within Tsarist Russia. I'd like to start off by having a look at this source first of all. What does it say about how the artist views Russian society, and what kind of person do you think made it? We can see here the strict hierarchy of Russian society. We can also see a growing sense of discontent within Russia, as we have the peasantry, the working people, on the very bottom, and they are constantly being oppressed by the army, the church, and the government. So it's a nice source to indicate a growing sense of opposition and discontent towards the Tsarist regime. So today we're going to look at opposition groups and basically hopefully understand key features of some of the different opposition groups. Now, before 1905, there were no political parties permitted in Russia. There was absolutely no form of democracy. Now, this meant that any party forming was illegal. It didn't stop political opposition, however. It just meant that all of it was technically illegal. There were lots of different opposition groups, and they came from kind of different political theories, and they had different aims, different makeups, different goals for Russia. The one thing that united these various opposition groups was their desire to see the end of Tsarist autocracy. Everything else about them is totally different, but that's the one thing everyone wants. So we're going to look at the populists. So they are kind of 19th century really, so it's more their legacy we'll be looking at today. The peasantry, workers, middle class, social democrats, and the SRs today. Now we're going to start with the common people. So the peasantry and the workers. Now remember, the vast majority of Russians are peasantry. Therefore, they might pose a great threat to the Tsar if they were to rise up in opposition to him. However, to be honest, this is fairly unlikely because of their mindset. They're incredibly traditional, religious. They believed in the divine right of the Tsar to rule, and therefore, although they were often unhappy with the government, it was never really their aim to rid themselves of the Tsar. Instead, their grievances were principally about poverty, and it really arose from desperation about how awful their circumstances were. Because poor old peasants, life has changed very little for them after the emancipation of the serfs in the 1860s by Alexander II. You'd expect, oh fantastic, everything's great now, we're free, life can only get better, but it doesn't. The peasantry are then landed with redemption payments, which is like a tax essentially on the land. And this is what is worsening their economic conditions. Therefore, their grievance is with the local landowners, really, not the Tsar himself. Now, it's important in Russia to separate peasantry and workers. So workers live in the cities. They're very urbanised, and their culture is quite different to the peasantry. So there is growing urbanisation within Russia, and so we have an emerging working class. You still have far more peasants than working class, but the working class is growing. And They are pretty unhappy with the Tsarist system, again, because of their socio-economic circumstances. So they are working incredibly long hours in really poor conditions with horrendous slum housing. So if you think all of the worst parts of the Industrial Revolution, that's happening here in Russia. Their pay is low. They're working for about 60 hours a week, and factory discipline is really harsh. Now, their method of opposition, of protest, is largely to go on strike. Now, these strikes are illegal, but that is how they do it. Okay, so we've got striking workers. In contrast, the peasantry, when they rose up, they attacked local landlords. So they would attack noble estates and basically go around smashing up everything that was rich and stinked of kind of bourgeois middle class uppityness. So there's a great line in Fides about them pooing on oriental carpets, for instance. So the peasantry and the workers, their grievances are mainly about their social and economic conditions. I'd like you now to read page 292 in your textbook, and for the peasantry and the workers, could you please create some notes on what is causing unrest, the frequency of the unrest, where that unrest is occurring for the peasantry, the methods being used by the workers, and make a judgment. How great a threat does this unrest appear to be against the Tsar? Now we're going to move into looking at some political groups. Now each group disliked Tsarism and wanted to change Russia, but they couldn't decide what a new Russia should look like. Some thought it should look like Britain and be a constitutional monarchy, where a strong parliament works with a monarch who has limited power. Think to your Britain course here. Others within Russia believed that we should return to a traditional Russia, a Russia descended from the state of Muscovy. And this was kind of embracing how Russian and Asiatic Russia was. So instead of looking to Europe, looking to Russia. And it's essentially hoping that you can have a kind of idealised Russian peasant society. If you want to think of someone, read some Tolstoy to tell you a little bit more about that idea. And lastly, there were those within Russia who believed that we should be working towards a new industrial paradise, one that had never been seen before in the world. So you kind of got a backward-looking, a forward-looking, and a European-looking set of views on what Russia should look like in the future. Now, those who wanted Russia to appear like Britain were the middle-class liberals. They looked over to Europe, they said, God, Russia's so behind, we need to turn Russia into a modern European country like Britain with a constitutional monarchy and a working parliament. Those who wanted an idealised peasant society were known as the populists. They were the social revolutionaries. Okay, so the populist is kind of the 19th century term for them, and the political group they're most associated with are the SRs, social revolutionaries. Again, Tolstoy. And lastly, those who are looking forward for a new industrial paradise are the Marxists. So this is the Social Democrats, and they later become split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. So now I'd like you to use the information on page 292 to 297 to complete this table. You need to remember which of the three kinds of Russias they want. And you need to think about where their support was, their main beliefs, and identify some important members and groups. That, it might be helpful to go back to your speed dating cards that we did earlier in the year. Right, to further consolidate this, use the same places and use the information in the opposition packs in order to complete these questions. Answer each question for each group. We're now going to look in a bit more detail at the ideas of this man, Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was a German thinker in the 19th century, and he was particularly interested in the development of human progress, I guess. Now, Marx visits Britain, of course, which is the most industrialised country at that point, and actually he kind of uses Manchester often as his great example. He works also with Engels, who always kind of gets a bit forgotten, really. So, Marx. His thinking, set down in his famous book, Das Kapital, was spreading through Europe. And it's really important because Marxism is the foundation of communism. So we're going to go and see now how this Marxist German ideas came through, filtered into Russia, and what impact they had. So let's start off, first of all, with what is Marxism. Now, essentially, Marx came up with a theory that would explain the progression of human progress, essentially. And it's like a historical model. He said society goes through each of these stages. It begins firstly with primitive communism, kind of the Stone Age, when people are working together to survive, nobody owns everything, everyone's equal. Then we get feudalism developing, where land is owned by an aristocracy and they exploit a peasantry. So that we're talking Middle Ages here. You then, after feudalism, get capitalism, where we get the emergence of a class system, where you have an upper class, the aristocracy, a middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, what he called the proletariat. You also see the emergence of democracy within the capitalist stage, but the primary winners of this are the middle classes. And the working class are being exploited through a process of immiseration by the upper class. He believed that you would have growing working class political consciousness through things like trade unions, and eventually, once you'd kind of developed enough along the capitalist phase, the workers would rise up in a bourgeois revolution and they would overthrow the middle classes, the bourgeoisie. Then you would get socialism, where the working class would rule through workers' organisations that would ensure everything was distributed fairly according to need through tax. Finally, once socialism had been achieved, Marx believed we'd then pass into a stage of a communist utopia, where everyone would work together for the common good, and actually there would no longer be any need for a government or money. Class would be totally gone now. Society would be classless, and it would be worldwide as well. So we also wouldn't need any nations anymore, any states. We wouldn't have nationalities as such. Now, that's Marx's classical theory. Marxism comes into Russia through Plekhanov. He's the one who brings it in, as in he's the one who translates Marx's work into Russian. And then, most importantly, Marx is then kind of tweaked a little bit by the Russian people, particularly by Lenin. So there's this divide that emerges in Marxist followers. Some of them say, yes, Russia will eventually become a communist country, but it can only do so by working its way slowly and organically through the various stages. It needs to firstly become a strong capitalist country, so it needs a better economy, more industrialisation, etc. Then the workers will become politically aware through things like trade unions and rising democracy. And from that, a revolution will naturally occur from the people. So we're talking at least 100 years before Russia moves out of the capitalist phase into communism. Now these people get known as the Mensheviks. There was another group of Marxist followers there, led by a man called Lenin. Now they become known later on as the Bolsheviks. Now the Bolsheviks believed that actually there's no need to organically go through each of these stages. If we have a revolution led by a vanguard of revolutionaries, we can immediately transition from capitalism, even very, very early stages capitalism that Russia was at, into communism. So as long as there's this vanguard of revolutionaries, the normal people will catch up with communism later. So here we've got an interesting split of those who want to see the development of democracy, the Mensheviks, because they believe in the long term this will lead to communism, and those who despise democracy and want to see it immediately overthrown in favour of communist revolution, the Bolsheviks. So, I've talked you through the theory, and here's just to tell you a little bit more about the background of these groups. So the first Marxist group to emerge in Russia is the Liberation of Labour from 1897. And like I say, it emerged from the work of Plekhanov, who's the man who translates Marx into Russian. The Liberation of Labour then evolves into the Social Democrats, the SDs, and in 1903 these split into the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. And the split is all about when are we hoping to move into socialism. Bolsheviks want it immediately through revolution, the Mensheviks are going to let it evolve naturally. Right, it's a bit confusing, I know, but hopefully that will have helped. If you look at page 296, it tells you all about Marx's theory of history. And I'd like you to use that information and the information in your opposition booklet and Corin and Fian, page 16, to answer the questions here. What's the difference between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks? Right, so we've looked at lots of different opposition groups. Who do you think was the greatest threat to Nicholas? In order to think about a great threat, think about these different things. Think about who has lots of support, who would be located in cities. Now, if you're going to take over Petrograd, that's going to be far more threatening to the Tsar than taking over, vast areas of Siberia, because you're 1,000 miles away in Siberia. It doesn't really matter. Is the anger targeted directly at the Tsar, or is it more at the Tsar's ministers and his government? And do they want reform, small change, small improvements? Or do they want the complete overthrow of the political system? You decide. Who was the greatest threat to Nicholas? Last thing for today then. We're going to look at some of these important opposition individuals, and we're going to do some more speed dating. I'm going to introduce you to Milikov, Struve, Chernov, Martov, Prince Lvov, Lenin, Trotsky and Gukov. You've got their information here in the next few slides, and you are once more going to be completing some speed dating cards. Your homework for this week is to create a flag of an opposition group, any opposition group you fancy. You must come up with a slogan, and we'll start next lesson seeing if the rest of the class can guess which opposition group you've made. I've also attached on Show My Homework some extra reading about the opposition groups from Orlando Figes. If you'd like to, if you're very interested in history, if you're thinking that you might want to go on to this at university, then have a read of that extra information online. Make sure all work from this lesson is completed. I'll come back on Friday expecting it to be done.